Hi, I'm Brandon, and I'd like to welcome you to the Crucible of Thought podcast. For the last few years, I've been rethinking a lot of my spiritual and political positions, and this podcast is where I explore the various topics and their impact on the church and the nation. And sometimes I just like to have fun conversations with people, and today is a great example of that. Today, I'm happy to, for a second time, have on my good friend Diego, and we are going to be talking about theology, basically. And actually, not just theology, but we're two friends. I'm not an atheist. Diego is. And we're working through some questions from different starting points. And this really isn't a debate as much as just a comparison of some of the spiritual load-bearing structures in our lives. And Diego, good to see you again. It's been a while since we did our previous episode.
Yes, it's very good to see you. And I'm glad for this discussion.
Yeah, and for a while now, we've been participating in some book studies, and so we've had plenty of good theological back and forth. Mm-hmm. And I really appreciate the fact that we can talk respectfully about these things and actually learn from each other.
Absolutely.
So I think one of the things that we've talked about, wanting to talk about for a while, has been this general concept of where do we get our values from?
Right.
Fundamentally, what is it that gives us meaning in our lives, and what do we use as a foundation of morality? Because certainly everyone has some sense of morality, no matter whether you pull it from a religious system or otherwise. And so I guess for each of us, the question is, where does that meaning come from? And are we appealing in that understanding to anything transcendent? So what are your opening thoughts on this?
Well, I think we were in one of our book studies, and at that time we had Jim on, and we sort of were hitting on this topic, and it was something that he said that has still stuck with me today. And we were talking about meaning, the definition of meaning and what I thought of as meaning. And he said something to me. He asked the question, well, what if you think it has meaning, but it really has no meaning, And I that made me really think about, okay, what is meaning? What is purpose? And then as I thought about that question, then, the concept of morality and how the three kind of intertwine is what got me to really start to study and to, look at different podcasts, read different books, talk to a bunch of people about it. And that's where I think when you and I spoke, we talked about maybe exchanging notes and ideas of how what has come about, since our last discussion, specifically that discussion. So I think to start, this idea of meaning, do you find meaning? Do you create meaning? And I don't think that meaning is something that you find under a rock. Like if you're looking for something, I think my thought process in conclusion would be that we create meaning. Same thing with purpose. We ourselves create this versus there being some exterior entity or force or whatever you may call it that is inherent in the universe, and that we somehow align with it. So that's kind of my position on it, if that sort of makes sense a little bit.
Yeah, it does. When you use the word universe, that almost has a transcendency to it, even if it's not looking at it from what we would call God as a Christian or a theist of another religion, but it still has a transcendent feel to it. That's an interesting thing that I've never seen before.
Yeah. Or could you expand on what you mean by that?
Well, sure. We're appealing to something that's larger than us in some sense, whether that's the universe. Certainly there are people like New Age people that look at Gaia or something about the earth or something about the universe that constructs things inherent to itself that we are part of, or we even instantiate. And so that is a transcendency that doesn't necessarily appeal to a theistic God, but it still understands that there's something beyond just us, just this thing that we in our minds construct.
Gotcha. Right.
So it kind of makes me wonder, when you're talking about that construction, so one of the things that I immediately observed when you said that was that I've been listening a lot to what Dan McClellan has to say about how we interpret the Bible and how the Bible has or doesn't have meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And he likes to point out that no text, no matter what text it is, whether it's the Bible, whether it's your history book, nothing has inherent meaning. And the reason he says that is because it's just a collection of color on a page,
mm-hmm.
on a piece of paper.
Right.
And the only thing that gives a particular word meaning is when I can put my context into it. So if I look at a word of ancient Akkadian, for example, I will not have any understanding of what that collection of shapes means. It has no meaning to me, even though to someone else who has a context for it, it does have meaning. And so his sense is that until we come to a situation with our context, there is no meaning inherent in anything. And I think maybe that to a lot of Christians probably feels snarky because they think, well, no, the Bible obviously has some inherent meaning. God gave it that meaning and we just have to discover it. But he likes to point out that no, actually we bring our own dogmas to the table and we pick out of the collection of marks on the page the things that lend support to that, and we discard the ones that don't. So even in his fairly theistic perspective, the texts that we usually as Christians would assign to creating that morality, creating that meaning, don't unless we choose to center them and give them that authority.
Mm-hmm. I think also something that you're bringing up that I was going to bring up is that I think meaning, even morality outside of human interaction, that I was going to say even there's no inherent meaning, but that has even worse than no meaning. What I mean is, so say on the moon of Titan, there are no humans there. Gravity and the physical laws may exist, but what does it matter if you say, it's illegal to break a speed limit on Titan? Like, so what? It only applies to as we interact within each other. Even the thought of, let's say you're on a deserted island and you're the only one there. Can you be immoral if you're just completely by yourself? I mean, what can you do that would be, self-harm? I think if you had a belief that there was something inherently, or you have an objective, definition of morality, how could it apply if you're, again, you're by yourself?
Well, in that case, I would observe that you're not actually, the planet is no longer empty. So you've brought yourself into the equation, and
right.
That brings even that, when you say the self-harm concept, you're no longer only populating the planet with yourself. You're bringing in an external context to the thing. So
right, and actually that's actually a good segue into the concept, say objective or subjective morality. It's something that has intrigued me, and I kind of go back and forth on that. I used to think that there was objective morality. Then I after just doing some research, I thought, well, I don't think there is any. And then I came very close to a concept of objective morality. But what I concluded was that even that is irrelevant. It's not necessary to for my foundation of life, I guess, and the concept of meaning and purpose within morality. So what I mean is that just like there are physical truths to the world, like if you come across a wall, I can't go through that wall. I can't walk through the wall. There's physical barriers to stop me. And the question is there such a thing as a morality that's objective, that no matter what you do, that you cannot, the same as a wall, right? Is there a I'm trying to understand the word between the two, that are comparable. And I think that when we look at all societies, no matter what the society, we do have these concepts of right and wrong, of why you would do something, why you wouldn't do something else. An example that was brought up is we can debate whether or not the drinking age should be 25, right? Or somebody else may say, well, I like it at 21 because, we decided it's 21. Somebody else might say, well, maybe 16 should be the drinking age. You guys are just too conservative. And even though you might debate about 16, 21, or 25, I think all three of us, and I don't know anybody on the planet that would say that there is some age that's inappropriate to give a 6-year-old alcohol. I don't know anybody that would say that would be moral, that would be good, that would benefit anything. So what is it? Even though it's hard to pin down where it is there such a thing? Is that the same thing as walking into a wall, for instance, when it comes to behavior? Right. And I think I was speaking to you, I was listening to a talk. And I would say a talk. It wasn't a debate. They call it a debate, but I like the way it was a discussion between this guy named T.K. Coleman and Stephen Bonnell. And they were talking about this. And that's where I said I was really intrigued by Coleman's description of what I just said. He went into a long discussion of, how he came about that. But what I came to decide in the end was whether or not I can pin down whether or not there's an objective morality. I think even a subjective morality is good enough. Just like when we do flight tests, and we're trying to decide what is the turbulence, levels 1 through 5. It's a subjective thing. Do we need to pinpoint exactly what a level 3 turbulence is? Is it necessary for us to be able to perform a task in life? Is it enough for us to live a life where we're happy, content, not hurting other people, or whatever we may decide, is a goal, for instance.
So you said in our pre-conversation that you appreciated T.K. Coleman's view for a while. What was his take on that? Which was his position?
His position is that there is objective morality.
There is subjective.
Objective.
Objective. Okay, so why did that appeal to you for so long?
Because
it held your attention for a while.
Yeah, because the thought of even someone who is, let's say, Ted Bundy, or someone who's a serial killer, or 3 men that decide they're going to go rob a bank, you could say that they're committing an immoral act. But when it comes down to they have the money and they're going to split it, if for some reason one of them takes more than the other, some reason they have some moral hurt, I guess the way he would put it, right? Or even Ted Bundy, they have very strong righteous beliefs in things, even though they would be called highly immoral for their behavior. So where does that come about that they have these I'm going to say imperatives, but just like hitting a wall, something that is morally out there that's affecting them in ways that they cannot necessarily control.
Are those things purely inherited? Because, you grew up in an evangelical church situation, even though you're no longer there. How much of the general way that you think was inherited from that as opposed to just intuitive and native to you?
And I don't know. And I think that's where my part of coming down on saying, you know what, I accept T.K. Coleman's conclusions and his discussion in making me decide that there is or isn't. I'm just not there yet because I don't know. Is it inherited, or is it a physical coding in the universe, like gravity? Right? There's an objective thing that we can measure and test and so forth and so on. I think the thing about morality, though, and purpose and meaning is that it's rather elusive. It's hard to test. It's hard to measure. It's hard to, but I guess intuitively, I feel like there's something there. And one of the things that I've learned, I think, throughout is, I used to be, there was a time when I concluded that there was no God, right? I'm an atheist. I'm still an atheist, but I no longer hold this dogmatic certainty that there is or isn't. I've also come to realize I don't think it matters. It matters, but I don't have to have this this 100% certainty.
Sure.
You know,
what was the final trigger for you to decide that Coleman wasn't right?
Well, that's just it. I don't think that he is wrong. I just don't.
So it's not necessary, in other words. It's
right.
Not that you. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm persuaded by a lot of what he says. The way he put it together. You know, I haven't seen anyone else do that in that way, to actually talk about the physical and because that's easier for us to understand. We understand that a chair, you know, we accept that a chair is a chair. But when it comes to these other things, and I think we're then heading into the concept of what a personal truth is and an objective truth. You know, I brought this up with you.
Yeah, let's get there in a few minutes. I had a couple more leading questions, though. I think one thing occurs to me is that my sense is that everything that we call religion, Christian or otherwise, came from people wrestling with the world that they see around them.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose you could argue that I have to step back for a second and say, you know, I just saw a little bit of video today from the show The Good Place.
Yeah, I've seen it.
You know, and I can't help but think I really wish I'd studied more people like Kant and some of these other people who have theorized these things for centuries. But anyway, as these people in the world preceding us have thought through all these things that happen around them, they've come to some conclusions about what is normal, what is moral, what is not moral. And I don't even think you really have to believe in a deity having laid down those laws to understand that humans kind of reach these conclusions on their own. The fact that it took so long to get to where we are now tells me that these things are not readily apparent all the time, that there's a lot of nuance to any system that you want to construct to describe the moral universe, if you want to call it that. So you have to maybe perhaps hold these things a little bit lightly because they're debatable, right? Now, we Christians certainly have formalized this into a certain package of beliefs, but I also am keenly aware that even within Christianity itself, there's an awful lot of disagreement about what this morality looks like. Just witnessed the last 5 years, realized that, you know, the idea of how we respond to someone claiming they're eating your dogs, they're eating your cats, shows a huge disparity in our understanding of just how to treat other humans. You know, witnessing what happened to the United States in the 19th century with the Civil War tells you that there's a pretty strong disagreement about basic moral codes. So I don't even think a Christian, if he's being honest, could claim that there is something resembling an absolute in most cases. We've chosen, I think, what we want to believe based on what we inherited from the people that came before us in our own particular faith tradition. And, you know, for me, I've had to choose which of those things I'm going to hold on to and which I'm going to cast away. So, I mean, to something you said before, you know, even if I can't prove it, it doesn't matter because things function a certain way. I choose to look at that thing and say, well, this works best for us. This shows a way of living in the world that, and I think the progressive Christian might use the phrase, what brings about the most thriving for another human is what is true, what is good. And so when we look at a systemic level, what causes societal thriving is probably what most people end up concluding eventually that is moral and is good. And so it's I think it's an evidence-based thing. I don't think we need there to be something that is universal and transcendent, because I think maybe it's just a functional thing that matters to us, not so much if there's a transcendency to it in the deepest sense. It's transcendent in the sense that it just works. And eventually, you know, I was going to get to, actually, I was thinking about sort of at the end saying this, but I'll say it now. One of the things that I love about our discussion as you and I got to know each other is that, you know, we live on this planet
and we have no other planet. I can start to segregate myself from others, but either way, as an atheist, I have to interact with theists. And instead of constantly, fighting with them about it, I can find that common ground, whether it's transcendent or not, because somehow we have to make it work. If we're going to build a house, we can sit here and we can argue about building the house, but eventually we need to build this house and we need to maintain this house. Yeah. So,
well, I think that's the point of the book that we're currently going through, is that Christians and non-Christians need each other for this all to work.
Yeah.
Which, is probably a problematic viewpoint for a Christian to accept, but I think the author makes a really strong case.
But I found with atheists the same. I have found a lot of let me say, it isn't like atheists are any more accepting necessarily. I'm trying to remember. I made a comment on this post about how religion, in my view, religion isn't the problem, it's the people within it, and I don't have a problem with there being religion. And this guy called me an idiot, a fellow atheist. And I just kind of, chuckled at that, because, a lot of atheists talk about being open-minded and they could be just as closed-minded. He didn't ask me he could have asked me more questions about what I meant instead of just making these conclusions, which theists and atheists do. So.
Okay. So I think what you've touched on already was one of the points we wanted to discuss, was this concept of moral relativism versus like a pragmatic functionalism.
Right.
And I think what we're kind of agreeing here is that, or not moral relativism, sorry, moral realism.
Yeah.
I don't even think maybe those are necessarily different now that we've talked about it a little bit. I think you and I both agree that there is something functional that happens in the world around us. And maybe I'm misunderstanding what you mean by moral realism, but I think that's just looking at the world and saying, well, there's just this reality that's out there based on the functionality of things. Are those labels different?
I don't know if they're different, but we can talk about a realism, all right? And then, and like I was saying before, I keep bringing up that wall or other physical things, gravity, affects the dog and you, and whether you believe it or not. And so moral realism is essentially the same thing, but again, it's much harder to pin down a concept of morality, whereas you and I deal with the physical realities, all the time.
True. It suddenly comes out of the realm of theory and into the realm of, well, we have to live together, like you said.
Right.
And by the way, lest people are wondering, that the book that we've been reading is Cross Purposes. Mm-hmm. So if you want to go look that up, it's really, it puts a different spin on things in a good way. So one of the analogies that you would use to talk about this was strawberry ice cream, and I'd love you to just flesh that out for us.
Yeah. So, the concept of a personal truth would be that and this is a truth for me, I love strawberry ice cream. It is my preference. It is my personal truth that I think is the best ice cream. But it isn't true for everybody, but it's true for me. And the same concept could be applied to something, and I'll get to this in a minute why, but concept of whether or not there is a God or there isn't. Me as an atheist come to, I don't like to use the word conclusion, but if you're 99.99999% there, you're pretty much there. Just like someone who's 99.99% believes that there's a God. So one thing about either is I can't prove there's no God, and right now there's no objective, I think, facts that you can point to say, here is God. God could just show up right now, right? Literally right now, right here, in our room and say, hey, I'm God, and it will prove it to you. But as far as I know, no one has that ability to bring those types of objective data to make it so.
And let's be fair. If that happened, you would probably, the average non-believer would point to the person and say, well, clearly you've got some psychosis going on, or you're hallucinating or whatever. But there's ways to explain any fact out of existence if you choose to.
Right.
But I was taught that the whole idea of my truth was, and this is in my evangelical days, that was deeply offensive to anyone who had an idea of there being actually objective truth. You know, I've come to swing on that significantly, I must say, since starting to deconstruct some of my theology, because I do begin to realize that I don't need there to be necessarily quite the absolute thing that everybody agrees on as I used to, partly because I realize that a lot of the things I used to absolutely believe have been proven false. So,
Gotcha.
Just like you were saying, you almost become agnostic about atheism, just like I'm agnostic in some senses about Christianity. And I've heard
without either one of us abandoning it, you know.
Right.
Yep.
And I've even heard strong theologians say that any truly honest Christian needs to be agnostic about what they believe, because otherwise there's no opportunity for us to repent of something that turns out not to be fully accurate.
Right.
So I understand that you had a conversation with someone about this. Can you relay that story?
Yeah, it was my friend Tracy, and we were talking about a conversation I actually had with somebody else at a church I went to. It was another discussion group, and I thought about how, say that you and her, right, are dear friends of mine, and I trust you implicitly. But if you or her, actually, you had a story, about a dream that you had, and so you're telling me something that I believe that you believe it, and I trust you, that what you're saying is true. So, I made a comment. Say she came to me and said, hey, I saw this alien. I conversed with it. I had a long conversation, and she comes to me. I'm going to tend to believe her. Now, the two of us, and I believe her, right, go to talk to somebody else and say, hey, this is what my friend Tracy found. They're going to ask for beyond more evidence than just, hey, she's a good friend of mine and I trust her. I know she doesn't lie. Okay. So at that point is what I meant about the personal truth thing. I have had some things that it's hard for me to explain, but I can't duplicate it. I can't bring you into it and say, look, this is exactly what I found. So, all of us as a group can begin to believe the same thing. So that's what I meant by like the personal truth versus an objective truth.
So the story you referenced, just to relate it for anyone who's listening, is that I, on a couple occasions, had a very specific dream that another person turned out to have the exact same night that I did, with no connection between the two of us, that we only learned about later and was proven to be an accurate dream. Yes, that's a possible coincidence. I know enough about things like, physics of uncertainty and stuff that yes, these things could randomly happen. I don't believe that's likely. And given my personal experience, I tend to accept that as de facto faith that there is something bigger than me involved in my life, and I have to assign the word God to that thing. The difference from where I was 15 years ago when that happened to today is I no longer need you, Diego, to agree with me that that is evidence of God. It's sufficient for me to move forward in my relationship with whatever that deity is, and not insist that someone who's never had that experience use it as proof of something that they have not experienced. And I admit that makes me probably unusual for the average Christian who believes that those things are absolutes and cannot be negotiated. What do I do with that? Well, I have to be humble about it. And that's been the biggest part of the change in my life in the last 6 years is coming to grips with the fact that there are things that I believe that I don't know. And I'm fine with that. I wasn't for a long time. So you talked about O'Connor's claim.
So let me explain that, because I really was interested in this video. Alex O'Connor is a YouTuber. He's a philosopher, and so he was talking about how even if there was a God, morality would still be subjective. And I thought, like, what do you mean? So I've listened to it several times, and then I think I understand. I think his failing, or at least the way the tagline is that this goes back to the whole thing of the personal truth thing. That because, like, in the end, right, your acceptance, I don't mean you, I mean a theist, acceptance of God without an objective proof that it can prove to you and I, that person is still coming to a conclusion that is subjective, regardless, because they can't prove it. But True. My thing is, I think if there was a God, right, it's like God creating a game, and the game has rules, and you're in that game. And since you didn't create the game, you don't get to say, hey, the rule is that killing is fine and that stealing is okay. If there was a God and he created that, if there was a God, then I would submit that the rules put out in a Bible, let's say it turned out that, we found out objectively that God did, in fact, because God shows up and he says, yes, every single word in the Bible is exactly as I say it is. Then I would have to conclude, since he created it, then that would have to be the objective morality. Mm-hmm. And that if I'm breaking it, whether or not I believe it or not, just like gravity, whether you believe it or not, you cannot break the rules of it. And I think where we broke down in his video was, I don't think he explained that part, because I brought this up in the last time we had the discussion, and I had a problem with him. He says that, no, there was nothing that would make him believe that there was a God. And I said, that's crazy, because if God showed up and did all kinds of the supernatural things, how could you, at what point are you really ignorant to say, no, you're not walking on water when you're walking on water, or whatever it might be. You know what I mean? So that's why I brought that up about how that, now from my perspective, since I am saying that there probably is no God, then where you come down on meaning of life, purpose of life, and all that is wholly created within you. Because if there's no God, what other source is there but you, but me? If that's the case, and I'm not concluding that for sure that's the case, I'm saying, here's the thing, right? I think that only one of two things can be true. Either there is or there isn't. Now, what kind of God is there? That is open to debate. It could be many kinds. The type that people believe is just a force, or the kind that is very personal, that can talk to you directly. Okay. And then there's the zero, like nothing. But given that one of those has to be true, I conclude that even if there was a God, based on everything, at least that I read, the interactions I have with you, that I don't want to say I'm good to go, but not to say I'm good to go, but this goes back to, I think, the original discussion we had about morality. And even though you and I might disagree on a bunch of things, I think in a collection of group of people, we can come to say, that killing just arbitrarily is a bad thing. Stealing for the sake of stealing is a bad thing. So there's something there that the two of us can sort of cling to without necessarily catching it like specifically, like definitively.
Yeah. So I want to step back to something you said early in what you were saying there about how people perceive. I'm going to summarize it this way: how people perceive the data that they have access to. And so if Alex O'Connor says, even if I saw God walking on water or whatever, my self-analysis, looking back over nearly 50 years of very conservative Christianity, was that I had been handed, or I prefer the word inherited these days, because you don't necessarily choose what you inherit. You just end up with things that get dumped in your lap. not necessarily always by choice. So I inherited a way of looking at the data that was around me. And so I would look at something that happened in a religious situation and I would say, that's proof that God exists, because to me, it's proof that God exists. I look at the amazing variety of creation, and that must be evidence that there's a creator of those things. I look at this thing that happened in my life, this dream, for example, and that's proof that God was speaking to me in a certain way. And one of the things I've had to confront in 6 years of reassessing all of the things that I grew up with was that in a lot of cases, I did actually convince myself of the existence of God based on something that could easily be interpreted some other way. Mm-hmm. Now, something like that dream, those two dreams in particular, I cannot so readily throw those away and say, no, that was just electrons and photons and protons aligning in a certain way just by happenstance. It's too unlikely for me to conclude that about that particular thing. But there were other things where, I remember an instance, for example, in a church that I attended in high school for a while, where we were praying for someone and we thought that we felt their rib move back into position, and everyone was like, "Ooh, God healed this person miraculously." And when I look back on it, I'm probably more inclined now to believe that we were just all pushing on that rib because we wanted it to be healed, and we felt something change and we all went crazy. Okay. So we chose to interpret something in that moment to sustain our theological understanding of the world around us. Mm-hmm. And so if I'm going to actually be humble about what I believe about my dogmas, then I have to allow for those things to be less than certain than I would prefer. Mm-hmm. So then that starts making me forced to confront the question of morality being objective or subjective, because it's in this document that I've chosen to give weight and authority in my life.
Right.
The things that I cannot be so subjective about, though, are what we talked about at the beginning again. What is objectively good for thriving of the humans around us, of the other people in our world, of the world itself? Mm-hmm. We can have a lot of disagreements over what is objectively good for people. You witness the disagreements, say, between Democrats and Republicans or conservative and liberals about, say, welfare, for example. Mm-hmm. What's the best for the thriving of the people, the society, the budget of our nation? Those things, you can have debates about that from now until eternity and probably never settle on it. But I think there's probably a lot of things where if you did look at it, there would be some objective measure of, if you kill a person, that's bad. That's not contributing to the thriving of them or society if you don't do something about that. And so I think there is some objectivity at play here. Now, this is a good time, I think, to hit this question of Euthyphro, which was a work by Plato. And he poses a question that I think we've kind of already touched on. There's two possibilities. And mm-hmm. the basic question he was asking is the good good because God commands it, if we believe in God, or does God command it because it's already good? And so on the one side, you get this idea of divine command. God commands it, therefore it is good. And so in that sense, morality is just whatever God says morality is. Mm-hmm. It takes away all authority from us, really. It mm-hmm. takes away all opportunity for us to negotiate with that morality and to look at what it really means. And the other horn of that equation is God commands it because it's already good. And I think someone like Richard Rohr, who's a very progressive Franciscan monk who has spent a lot of time writing and thinking about these things, would say, well, love is the truth, capital T, and whenever love is expressed, God is expressed. And in that sense, God is commanding what is already good. But ultimately, I think what Plato was getting at if I'm understanding his argument correctly, is that both horns of this dilemma end up kind of assuming the same thing, that God's will and the good are kind of separate things that we need to figure out the relationship between them. I think the school of theology that I tend to follow, and I tend to find myself really aligning with Gregory of Nyssa and the Alexandrian traditions from the early church fathers, actually is you don't even have to pick, which is interesting because it kind of goes to what I've been saying all along, that maybe these things are more subjective than we want to admit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically to deny the premise that there's a separatableness, if you will, between God and goodness, between deity and morality. God doesn't have a will that either invents goodness or chooses to abide by it or obey it, if you want to use those phrases. It's simply the nature of what I choose to call good. God. Mm-hmm. Good and God are the same thing. And so there's no separation there. Now, I will at the same time readily say that when I look at the Bible, I start to recognize that there's an awful lot of ways that I was taught the first of those two horns. God said it, therefore it settles it, right? And things like reading the story of Joshua and his invaders in the land of Canaan, slaughtering everything that moves, because God said, well, they're in your way. No other reason. They're in your way. I don't want you to be polluted by them. So slaughter them all. Women, children, cattle, burn the gold, burn up all the tents. And we see a rather different picture at different other places in the Bible. So is God good? How does that fit into our definition of good? And so I think as Christians, we understand that we've kind of chosen one of those pathways of understanding what good is. I think a lot of Christians assign good as to whatever God said.
Right.
I tend to take the opposite position these days because I don't think that that's demonstrably true when we look at what that does to humanity, what that does to the greater picture of what goes on in the world. Is that making us God? I don't know. I don't think so. I think it's recognizing what's there, objectively there.
Right. And I think that's where we find the commonality. Because I have thought about, how is it when I used to be a theist, and I'm talking to you, yet we find this incredible amount of commonality. And it's because the two horns you're talking about, at least the one where, you live in the world and you see the results, even without whether or not there is a God or not. I think there is some truths there, and we're trying to find where it is, but I don't think I need to find it exactly. It's like the atom, where you don't know exactly where it is, but it's there, with the Heisenberg principle and that kind of stuff. Sort of pivoting a little bit, because the talk is supposed to be about also meaning and purpose. And going back to what Jim was saying about meaning, when I wake up in the morning and I get up, one of the things I do every single day, wife and I do, is we make the bed. And I've known people who do not make the bed. And I ask them, well, why not? There you go. Right. Perfect. And, the answer is, well, you're going to get in it, later in the day. So why make the bed? And I can find a reason, right? It's for me to make it. And I can find meaning in making the bed. And there's a purpose for me to make the bed, even though it's not permanent. And I can apply that to my entire life. You and I are having this discussion, okay? And it's being recorded. It's going to be played out. Some people are going to see it. Would this discussion be seen in 100 years, in 1,000 years, in 1,000,000 years, right? Would it be remembered? And the answer is probably not. So does that mean that it's meaningless? No, it has meaning to me now. It has meaning to you right now. It might have some meaning in someone who's trying to create that purpose or meaning in their life at that moment. And so, there are people that lived 1,000 years ago, completely forgotten. Totally. Does that mean that their life was meaningless? Does that mean that they had no meaning? No, at that time they had meaning. Mm-hmm. we live for moments, not to remember days. I can't tell you. We were driving by this one place with my wife, and we looked over. We said, "Hey, we saw a movie there, and it was where you eat and see a movie." And I said, I remember that. You remember it. It was memorable to us. Do you remember the movie that we saw? No. Do you remember what you did the day before or after? No. Days completely and totally forgotten. But at the time, they had their meaning. So meaning doesn't have to be, for me, something that is for all eternity, because it means something right now. And I think that's what struck me when Jim said, well, maybe you think it has meaning, but really has no meaning. I think, as I mentioned this before, right, all of history, the 13.9 billion years or whatever it is, comes down to this moment. The fact that dinosaurs are completely died out, that means that the dinosaurs were meaningless? No, if you're a dinosaur walking around eating, they had their meaning. They wanted to eat. They wanted to sustain their life. So I think that when in trying to find meaning, you can always keep asking why. I remember I had this talk with a friend of mine, and we were talking about going on a cruise, and he goes, "Why?" And I said, "Well, because it's fun, and
a
blah, blah,
cruise.
blah." Yeah. And he goes, "But why?" And as he kept asking, it's a good question I asked, like, okay, why do we cruise, right? Does it, in the end, I have 32 cruises. Do I remember all 32? No. Some are completely lost to me unless I bring up some pictures. But it doesn't mean it was meaningless, and I enjoyed it at the time. So I think you can begin to get into a spin cycle with trying to find purpose or trying to find meaning, when I think the realization for me is that you create that meaning, you create that purpose for whatever it might be. And hopefully it's a purpose that brings you happiness. You could decide, and this is what I see in these debates about how, well, what makes you, not me, but, a person say that the Holocaust was right, or, killing fields in Cambodia were fine, or why do something that is pleasurable? Well, that's a choice. It's a choice you make. And I find meaning and purpose in my life with, we call it simple things, but, taking care of my wife, taking care of my house, taking care of the people I love, making friends with you. This is sufficient for me. I don't need to find some super deep rooted thing that has to last for eternity for me to decide to do it versus, 1,000 years from now, 30 years from now, I doubt I'll be alive. It's not necessary for me to then give up on things now when I can enjoy things and bring happiness to people now, as opposed to deciding I'm going to create harm.
Yeah.
And spread that.
The phrase that came to me when you started talking was incremental good.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the problems of being Christian is that we tend to always be focusing on the eternal.
Right.
And there's an actual value of incremental good, and ephemeral value is not valueless. One of the things I've thought about as we started talking about this in the past was that if you're doing good for someone around you, that changes their life, and that gets passed on to the people that they impact, and that gets passed on to the people that they impact. And so you are making an eternal impact in some sense, even if it's not the kind that a Christian would look at and say, well, and honestly, as a believer, I would say that I think most Christians, if you really press them, would ultimately say, well, I'm not really doing anything that God isn't doing God's self. Mm-hmm. I'm out here doing imperfect work, and God wants me to be God's hands and feet to make these things happen. But ultimately, it's God's responsibility to do these things in the world. So if I just disappear, God will get it done anyway. So is there even any eternal good in what I do? If you're perhaps a little more thoughtful like that, you might realize that this whole idea of eternal good that we bring to the world is probably not much different from this idea of ephemeral value. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that also occurred to me while you were talking was I was reading a story today about capital punishment and how the idea is that in some areas they are rethinking the use of firing squads because supposedly that's a better, more humane way to kill somebody if, we can be so crass. And the idea that it's less prone to going wrong, and then the arguments that, well, there's been a lot of botched shooting deaths where, the assigned trigger pullers deliberately aim sideways and hit the person's lung instead of their heart so that they suffer for minutes before they die. And the thing that occurred to me while you were talking is that at some level, why does that matter? They're going to die either way. It's just a matter of how long that pain lasts, and they're not going to remember that pain after they're dead, right? Or do we? We don't know. But I think there's this thing deeply rooted in most humans that causing suffering, period, is a bad thing, even if it's temporary, because everything ultimately is temporary. It's just a matter of, is it 80 years that we remember it, or is it 3 seconds? Does it matter? And I think our sense of humane and humanity is we don't do that, even if it's for 3 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Can we, as painful as this is to discuss, can we find a way to kill someone that doesn't cause them any pain at all, 100% repeatably, reliably? And so far the answer has not been yes. Actually, there is one way to do it, and that's to put a bullet through their brain. And we just don't like that because that's messy. Yeah. But we don't want to cause harm. And I find that interesting that doesn't depend on anything other than that ephemeral thing that's happening right in the moment.
Right.
And so at some level, I think the fact that we, even as Christians, have a deeply held value that that's not right to do almost puts us into the sense of really caring about the ephemeral just as much as we care about the eternal. And I don't know exactly what to do with that. That's a kind of an uncomfortable thought in some ways. I have to admit, though, that, the way that I'm talking and thinking tonight probably would absolutely shock Brandon of 20 years ago or 5 years ago even, because I'm not talking like a deeply devoted evangelical theologian anymore. I'm looking at the world from a very pragmatic, subjective view of things. And I honestly think that's more honest. I still hold on to the faith that I have because I've experienced some things I can't talk about. But what is the value of things? I think there is a lot more. And when I look at the scriptures these days, talking about value and purpose, I think Jesus spent a lot more time looking at people's lives than he did about their post-death future. When he used the word salvation, he was generally talking about bringing succor and freedom and deliverance from what they were experiencing right now. And that, I think that bears sitting with for a Christian. The ephemeral stuff actually does matter to God, just like it matters to an atheist. And I think if we can find a point of agreement on that, that's a pretty powerful opportunity to work together.
And by the way, I think a question you asked is, do we need to agree? I think that it helps at times to agree. And then do we need to differ? I think it helps to differ.
Because when I see the world from your point of view, it expands my thinking. It expands my awareness.
And mine too. Exactly.
And we benefit from that relationship, even if we choose ultimately not to adopt one of those core principles.
Right.
So, I mean, so you kind of answer the closing question then. What do you see as value in the world for you?
Value. I think what I was saying, the fact that I'm alive now. And so it matters to me to that drink of water that I took because I was thirsty. I needed it now.
Well, and you recognize that in other people, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think where we have a problem is when I begin to deny you that because, I become so selfish that I value myself so much, or my immediate needs where I'm trampling on another. And then, the thought could be, well, you're an atheist, in the end, does it matter? And I say, yeah, I think that it would matter. And I can say it matters now. Whatever you may say about it doesn't matter then. I think it's inescapable that it matters right now to it may not matter later, but it matters now. And I hold on to that to always check myself with what I do and how I affect others. So the value I have is, in that I come to enjoy my life, even though from my perspective it's going to end forever. It didn't exist before I was born. Again, this is the way my worldview, and it doesn't scare me. Does it make me sad? One of the things that Alex Lucano one time said was, he doesn't believe in God, but he wishes that there was, or at least the loving God that, we discussed. I would wish that there was, but my wishing, at the moment, I don't have that objective, conclusive evidence that there was a God when I used to believe that there was. So.
And so I would say, as far as the value and the purpose, what you said, I have to fully agree with. And the only modification I would make is that I tend to think that that's why Jesus said, whether he was God or not, he was right when he said that one of the two most important commands is treating others as we would want to be treated ourselves. And perhaps that's purpose enough for us to gather around, whether or not we agree on the love God part. And because that ultimately results in a better world for both of us.
I totally agree. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's a great place to wrap this up. I think there's a lot of space. I'd love to spend some more time talking about the value and purpose side of things, because I think we spent most of that talk on morality. Mm-hmm. And I don't think you can get to the value and purpose until you've talked about the morality. So
yeah, right.
It'll be a space for another conversation,
but
which is cool because I love these.
Yeah, me too.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time tonight, and we will definitely do this again.
Thank you.